safety.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
I'm NASA Shaniqua Vereen, and we are live inside the White Flight Control Room at the Johnson Space Center here in Houston, Texas. We are bringing you live coverage today of the distant retrograde orbit departure burn. This is a quick burn expected to fire for 1 minute and 45 seconds, beginning at 3:53 and 50 seconds p.m. Central Time. The distant retrograde orbit is an elliptical orbit or oval shape around the moon. This orbit is unique to Artemis I, testing out its various systems, and will not be used on future Artemis missions. We'll have NASA's Dan Hewitt back at the moon board to explain a little bit more about the distant retrograde burn and how it affects leaving the distant retrograde orbit. We'll catch up with them a little bit later, but for now, here are some shots inside the Artemis Mission Control Room. And we're hoping for some views from Orion a little bit later. Currently, you're seeing the arrow tracker used to track Orion, seeing current velocity, distance from Earth, and distance from the moon. Following a successful launch on Wednesday, November 16th, NASA's uncrewed Orion spacecraft is ready for its distant retrograde orbit departure burn today on day 16 of its 25.5-day mission beyond the lunar surface. Orion lifted off atop the Space Launch System rocket at 1:47 a.m. Eastern Time from Launch Complex 39B at NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida. The distant retrograde departure burn prepares Orion for a second lunar flyby, or that RPF, the return powered flyby, and Earth insertion burn, and finally preparation for a re-entry and splashdown planned for December 11th. At the time of the outbound powered flyby, Orion was just 81 miles above the lunar surface. Throughout the mission, the spacecraft performed a series of outbound trajectory correction burns to put Orion in the proper configuration to enter the distant retrograde orbit. So remember, 81 miles above the lunar surface, Orion surpassed the distance record for a mission with a spacecraft designed to carry humans to deep space and back to Earth at 7:42 a.m. Saturday, November 26. That record was set during the Apollo 13 mission at 248,655 miles from our home planet. Today, we are live covering the distant retrograde orbit departure burn, or the DRD, which will bring Orion out of the distant retrograde orbit to prepare Orion for a splashdown back on Earth. Again, splashdown is planned for December 11th. And we are looking for the burn for the distant retrograde orbit departure burn to happen at 3:53 and 56 seconds p.m. Central Time. Again, let's get a little insight from NASA's Dan Hewitt at the moon board.
It's been a fantastic mission, but all great things must come to an end. It is time for Orion to leave its orbit around the moon and come home. So we are getting ready for distant retrograde departure. This is going to be a firing of those engines on the European service module to actually commit us to leaving the lunar orbit and coming back towards Earth. So we're again going to be using that large main engine to start to swing us back in close so we can do essentially a slingshot around the moon. We'll be dipping in again for another powered flyby, this one called the return powered flyby, which is really going to kind of fine-tune our path back towards the atmosphere. But the one really committing us to come home is going to be this one that's coming up, this distant retrograde orbit departure. So for Orion, it's going to be farewell to the moon until it starts making its way to us back here on planet Earth.
Now I have a special guest today on console. She will discuss the deep space radiation environment and what we are learning on missions like Artemis I. Hi, Robin. Thank you for joining me today. And can you tell everyone what a space radiation element scientist is?
Of course. So as a space radiation element scientist for the Human Research Program at NASA, I am responsible, along with my excellent team, for developing and executing a robust research strategy to understand, characterize, and hopefully mitigate the health impacts to humans from the space radiation environment. And so when we talk about space radiation, why does NASA care? Well, turns out space is a radiation environment, and so our astronauts are actually radiation workers. And so that means that we know that radiation is a health hazard for them, and we need to do our best to characterize that and mitigate that. And so this radiation comes from 3 different places. in our universe, and so you can imagine how fast these particles are going. And then we have trapped radiation. Trapped radiation is actually a consequence of our Earth having a beautiful magnetic field, and it protects us from all sorts of things, but it also traps some of that radiation that's zipping around out in our solar system inside these belts, which are called the Van Allen belts. So those are these sort of donut-shaped rings around our planet. And then thirdly, and probably the most well-known, are solar particle events. And these are when the sun sort of belches out some extra solar particles and out into our solar system.
And you mentioned solar particles. Can you explain a little bit of what those are and how they could affect the Artemis missions to come?
So the sun is a giant rotating ball of magnetized plasma, which is sort of mind-blowing when you think about it. And you can actually see these with the appropriate kind of telescope from down here on Earth. These sunspots can create sort of active regions where the local magnetic fields are really entangled. And just like anything, something that builds and builds and builds energy, at one point it just gives up. And so these magnetic fields, they break and they reconnect down into a lower energy state. And so that energy is released at this huge amount of energy release, some of which can actually push particles out from the solar corona, as well as the particles out in the solar system out into the solar system. And so that's what's called a solar particle event, when those particles are accelerated out from the sun out into the solar system.
Awesome, and that is definitely something worth caring for. On Artemis I, on flight day 13, on November 28th, Orion reached its maximum distance from Earth. Now, we know that that maximum distance was 268,563 miles from our home planet. How will being further from Earth affect our crew on future Artemis missions?
And so them being further away from Earth means that in mission, real-time monitoring of the solar environment is really important, because if you are going to be exposed to these solar events, we have to have some way to shield it, because even though we can't shield from galactic cosmic rays, we can shield from solar particle events relatively effectively. So our operational team, the Space Radiation Analysis Group, or SRAG, they've actually developed an awesome protocol, which is to build a storm shelter. And I think we have a great video that demonstrates what this looks like.
And so the whole point is for us to get into a really cool little shelter and take all the equipment we have in this capsule and put it over us as best as possible. And we have to make sure it's stowed and that we are safe and we have everything we need in terms of supplies down in this awesome little bay.
So you can see there, they build this basically is what amounts to a pillow fort, and putting all of that mass around them to keep those lower energy particles from solar particle events out of their little pillow fort there, and keep them sheltered from that storm.
But the pillow fort is stowage bags and different things that are already in Orion for the crew, and they're using that during a solar particle event to protect themselves.
And so they can hang out in that little area for the entirety of the event. Of course, they can come in and out of that shelter. They don't need to stand there the whole time.
And so as far as protection goes, again, for our astronauts on future missions, we know this is an uncrewed mission, but future missions will have astronauts aboard. What can we expect beyond this for astronaut protection in terms of radiation?
So like you said, this is it's uncrewed, but even on these first short-term missions, we are still learning things about the radiation environment. We have a radiation detector up there now, HERA, which is constantly taking data right now, and we're actually seeing how those what makes that pillow fort. We have a sensor in there right now, and we can see that it actually is providing protection compared to the sensor that is outside of that bay when they transited through the Van Allen belts, because it's a similar type of radiation to solar particle events. But moving forward, the uniqueness of the space radiation environment really makes for a hefty challenge when it comes to doing research down here on the ground. So we don't have the same amount of protection strategies up in space as we do down here on the ground. But of course, if we're talking about a year mission to the moon, we're talking about 3 years mission to Mars, time starts to become a problem too. So that's where the space radiation element is coming up with new strategies of how we might be able to protect the crew, which includes things like health monitoring, early disease screening for the things that we are concerned about, including cancer, cardiovascular disease, immune changes, and potentially even neurocognitive defects, as well as looking for some sort of compound-based countermeasure that can help the body protect itself from that biological damage. We might not be able to stop the physics, but we might be able to help the biology.
We talked about the protection. We talked about space radiation. Is there anything left that we didn't talk about that would be relevant to what we're learning about space radiation on this mission or even future missions that are planned?
On this mission in particular, I really just want to give a huge shout out to our operational team, the Space Radiation Analysis Group, because they have worked so hard on getting their detectors up to speed, and they're really starting to see their models play out. And so just a really huge shout out to that team, because they have done an amazing work. They're working 24-hour console to support this mission, and they really deserve mad props.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Robin, for coming and joining us here today, telling us a little bit about the deep space radiation environment and why it's important to the Artemis missions overall.
Thank you so much, Shaniqua. Happy to be here.
And if you just joined us, you're watching live coverage of the Artemis I mission. Today we're on day 16 of the 25-and-a-half-day mission. We are currently awaiting the DRD, or the distant retrograde departure burn. And we're looking for that burn to happen at 3:53 and 56 seconds p.m. Central Time, 4:53 and 56 seconds p.m. Eastern Time. That's the distant retrograde orbit departure burn for Orion. Again, that will be aired at 8:30 a.m. Central Time. And again, that is on December the 5th. Before we air that December 5th, be sure to check out live coverage of the U.S. EVA on December the 3rd. Showtime beginning at 5 a.m. Central Time, 6 a.m. Eastern Time. Our live views from Orion have gone briefly. Again, we had a nominal distant retrograde orbit departure burn. Follow the blogs at blogs.nasa.gov/Artemis. Again, thank you for joining us, and that'll wrap coverage for today.